This is the second session, and this session is what we called a Borderland biography. And I'm going to kick off and then hand over to Jan and Rasool, and then I'll say a few concluding comments at the end, and we'll have question and a time for question and answer. So, but if you have questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A section. So in the last session, we looked at some of the overarching findings of the research. And in this session, we zoom into the borderlands of Nimroz province on the border between Afghanistan and Iran. And doing this, we hope to provide you with a more grounded feel for the research that we've been doing in one particular locale. And we aim to present what we've called a borderland biography, or a spatial history of the margins. Now, we have no pretensions to this being an exhaustive account. And instead, what we're doing is providing, if you like, some fragments from the frontier. And in so doing, we hope to show how borderlands are a privileged vantage point for understanding Afghanistan's drug economy and the lives that have been shaped by it. Next slide. So just to say a few words about what we mean by a borderland perspective. And across the project, we've been conducting research in borderland regions in order to try and develop these spatial histories of these frontier and borderland regions. And our goal is to produce a book which brings together these different spatial histories. And what combines this kind of effort is, firstly, an attempt to develop spatial histories of illegality. So what I was saying earlier in at the beginning of the conference, the need to defetishize drugs and to embed them within a wider historical and socio-cultural setting. And we call these spatial histories because we see space and territory not just as backdrops to social action, but they're agentic spaces. They're deeply entangled in and shape the political economy of drugs. And there's a deeper point here in that how things develop depends upon where they develop, and what has been historically sedimented there in terms of the social and spatial structures already in place. The second point to make here is we're trying to decenter understandings of drugs and development. As I've said repeatedly now, we don't see borderlands as lagging regions or residual that have been bypassed by development processes. They're places of rapid change and innovation. The margins never stand still. They're shaped by cascades of change and transformation wrought by war and by drugs. Thirdly, a borderland perspective means taking a relational perspective. Centers and peripheries, which are terms which are themselves problematic, they co-produce each other. The frontiers of Nimroz shape power relations and processes of investment and accumulation elsewhere. So we need to understand how the margins are not only reflective of wider processes of state formation and development, but how they are also constitutive of those processes. And a final point to make here is that we are explicitly trying to engage with the voices and the experiences of those living on the margins, where illicit economies are a lifeline, a form of social insurance, and also a vehicle for advancement. These voices are rarely listened to or highlighted in mainstream accounts. And we aim through these borderland biographies to give more prominence to the perspectives of those living in the margins. Next slide, please. So before handing over to Jan, I think it's just important to emphasize how important Afghanistan's borderlands have been historically and are today when we're looking at the dynamics of state building, war making, development, and illicit economies. And that's why this relational perspective is important. What we can see historically, sorry, Adam, can you turn off your microphone, please? The perspectives, sorry, the shifting configurations of power between center and periphery between these kind of centrifugal forces of illicit economies and war making and the centripetal forces of state making have been something that have continued throughout Afghan history, and we can see them in the present day as well. Also, drugs have been centered in borderland regions. They're key hubs for drug economies, sites of production and of processing. And there's been a trend for the consolidation of that in the post-bond period of state building, where state building, counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics, the things that Adam was talking about in the last session, have pushed the sites of production increasingly into the marginal and often the Taliban-controlled areas in the borderlands. The borderlands are also key sites of trafficking because the existence of the border creates a gradient where price steps up. So the borders become zones of opportunity where rents are accumulated, and these rents shape the kinds of political settlements that Jan was talking about in the last session. And finally, something we haven't really talked about, but is part of our research, these borderland regions are also increasingly sites of drug consumption, with the emergence of new drug markets, particularly in provincial centres in the border regions. So the border regions are places where things happen. And we can see this visibly in the processes of inward investment and frontier boomtown dynamics of Zaranj and Torkham, for example. And peripheral drug economies make things happen elsewhere as well. If you think about the property markets and the investment going on in Kabul and Dubai based on the proceeds generated in the borderlands through drug trafficking. It's also important, they're also important in terms of shaping the state, not least because of customs revenues being so key to the fiscal base of the states, and also being very significant in relation to Afghan politics. Think about how drug revenues have funded election campaigns and shaped national political settlements. Finally, borderlands are important, but they're important in different ways. And that's why we're interested in studying in our project the differences as well as the commonalities between borderlands, trying to think of them, these differences along key axes of comparison in terms of the role of drugs, the historic salience of these border regions, the history of violence, the social landscapes, and the dynamics of drug economies. So trying to tease out those differences and similarities, I think, is key to better understanding drug economies and better responding to them. I'll hand over now to Jan and Rasool Khan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can we have the next slide, please? So what we want to do in the next couple of minutes is basically, as Jonathan already mentioned, that we cannot provide yet a full-fledged borderland biography from all these different angles. But we want to have a look at how biographies evolved in the context of the changing and transforming borderland that we have been studying. So as a guiding question we pose here, how and why have illicit drug economies become entangled in and shape the lives and livelihoods of borderland communities in Nimroz? And we would develop that from two life history that we researched in greater depth. And see basically how they adapted to the political, economic transformations and ecological changes shaping the borderland. For that, we basically first present, that's something I will do, historic geographical placement of Nimroz, not really history, but just important aspects of the geography, demography, and history. Then Rasool Khan OSDR will introduce two cross-border traders, one apex broker and one smaller time trader, and their biographical steps, and then we'll connect that again with the with aspects of the spatial history of Nimroz as part of the wider region, and conclude. Jonathan will then conclude with some remarks on this. So that's basically the idea. Can you move one slide on? I just right now, I don't know if yes, thank you. That's correct. We will use that slide now. So Nimroz is is the most sparsely populated and amongst the least developed provinces of Afghanistan. It has, however, a highly dynamic demography with a high mobility and a history of more or less successful adaptation and swift adaptation to cross-border opportunities and risks. More than half of the population has resided elsewhere, and that is even before the most recent shifts because caused by the crippling drought since 2018, and then the Taliban takeover and 2021. And this mobility, and that is comes up very clear in virtually all interviews conducted, life histories, but also with traders and different people from different walks of life in Nimroz. It's very much related to a history of free migration to and return from Iran. It's a dominant theme in virtually all of the interviews. It's more with Iran than less so with Pakistan, Baluchistan, which borders to the south. Today, it is mostly an arid desert landscape, vulnerable to crippling droughts, but also to occasional devastating floods. There have been periods of sufficient irrigation historically, as it even has been related to a breadbasket in the more distant history of the region. And more recently, there have been technological improvements that extended access to arable land in parts of the province, however, not so much the border districts themselves. It's more inland parts like Khashrod. Geographically, it has been part of the Sistan-Bas Basin, which you can see here, well, if you can make it out in the presentation. That's basically part of this bluish area. Has been part of the Sistan Basin, where major river systems drain into hamuns, so-called hamuns, which are flat lakes or wetlands that are only lakes and wetlands when the rivers carry water, which they only do in times of no drought, which has not been the case during the field work here. For the more distant history, has been mentioned that this situation was different and it was more arable. Water is a dominant subject, both irrigation and drinking water, and a dominant concern since decades, and has been subject to major infrastructure projects like the Kamal Khan Dam pictured here before its finalization or inauguration in 2001. In 2021, I'm sorry. It has started already in '74 and has been a project, a never-ending large infrastructure project that also caused periodic frictions about scarce water supplies between Afghanistan and then downstream Iran. It has not been solved yet and not really been put in use because the channel system is still missing, despite the inauguration. And recently, I mentioned that already, but it's important, these technical innovations, more local tech innovations like deep wells, tube wells operated by diesel generators initially, and then since 2017-16, roughly, solar power became more commonly used, and it increased access to agriculture before the drought, mostly in Zaranj, around the main city, Khashrod, and Robat areas of Charbojak. Basically, yeah, two pictures I already mentioned. The other photo here, and this photo by OSDR doing the research. It's the Helmand River, basically, when it still was carrying water. Next slide, please. So Nimroz has a history of long-distance trade preceding the Afghan state as part of a wider regional space shared between Persia and then Iran, India, and then Pakistan and Afghanistan. It emerged on the shatter zone between empires and polities, with a long history of trade and smuggling illicit and illicit goods, among them weapons, drugs, fuel, and people. Control over the frontier space has been periodically contested between those polities, between those three powers, but remained mostly, and this is important, indirect until recently, and gave the mobile and semi-autonomous but marginalized groups some leverage over central politics, using choice of loyalty as a bargaining chip vis-a-vis the centers of power. It's a multi-ethnic region where Baluch are the dominant group in the immediate border districts and Pashtun in the hinterlands. You can see it here, the lighter color is basically Baluch language groups, and the darker pink is basically Pashtun language groups. Still today, the Baluch transnational networks in the borderland of 3 states pivotal in facilitating and controlling cross-border flows in goods, people, and also ideas. Next. So the region is shaped by historic marginality on the edges of truncated Afghan as well as Iranian and Pakistani state-building processes. It remained, Nimroz remained one of the lowest human development indicators for Afghanistan throughout the recent decades. However, there have been some significant changes in terms of state presence that have been taking place over the past 2 decades. The state formation has not been linear, sometimes episodic and selective, but consequentially affecting urban areas and hinterlands in very different ways. And I want to highlight like two main aspects here. One is the opening of the Milak-Zaranj border as official border crossing with Iran in 2005, and the associated construction of the Zaranj-Delaware highway, finished in 2009, connecting the province to the Afghan Ring Road on the one hand, and Iranian ports and trading hubs on the other hand. And that set off some boomtown dynamics for Zaranj, and you can see this here on the left-hand side in the pictures, basically how the city increased in size between the early 2000s and then 2019. So our estimate in terms of population statistics are difficult to come by. It's most likely nearly a 10-fold increase that took place. So it became an official trading hub, but and benefited from official trade like fuel, construction material for all of Afghanistan, and consumer goods, but also smuggling of licit and illicit goods like fuel, drugs, and migrants. However, and that's pictured on the right-hand side, top right-hand side here, since 2009, Iran made a major push to limit open access across the border and significantly increased border infrastructure and control regimes along its eastern border with Nimroz. This border delineation and hardening did not end, but redirected and transformed these connection flows, as we'll see in a second. In consequence, the writ of the state, or of the states, I should say, because it's 3 states involved here, increased, but only along certain landscapes: the border, the highway, the provincial centers. Much of the hinterland remained out of the reach of the state, for better and worse, and increasingly under Taliban control. Next slide, please. So what we want to show now is basically how the growing but selective and truncated presence of states in an historically open frontier region located at the margins of Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan, changed opportunity structures and livelihood strategies for people engaged in illicit as well as licit cross-border trade. And we'll do this by drawing on life history research, and discuss that by highlighting key moments showing how 2 different placed traders navigated the changes throughout their careers. And the first life history relates to a trader from modest minority background who established himself as an apex broker between traders, local state representatives, and the Taliban. And the second one will deal with a smaller trader or tertiary broker pushed out of the fuel smuggling into drug trade. And yeah, basically, next slide, please. So before I hand over to OSDR, it's just one, it's a broker that we interviewed, or that OSDR should say interviewed in 2021. I just want to, one quotation that I want to share with you here is this, that I found characteristic for his approach. I'm Hazara, Pashtun, Tajik, and Baluch. I don't have any specific tribe, and I'm the elder and servant of all tribes. Rasool please explain what he took.
Thank you, I will present two life story from the south borderland from Nimroz. And the first is belong to the famous person. He is a broker and also he is a large trader. He is born in Lashkargah city in Helmand province. Please, next slide, sorry for that to show in the map. And he's born in Lashkargah city in Helmand province in 1975. Originally, he is a family from Chakhansur district of Nimroz province. Please click on the map. Province and his father was arrived to Lashkargah and was a shopkeeper there. He sold fuel in his shop. Next, click in the same map. Sorry. Yes, and he is Shia Hazara, and he is a flexible person. He excellent speaking and Pashto, Dari, and Baluchi. He sold his agricultural land in Helmand in 1995 and arrived to Zaranj and start work in Godare Mushtarak. Please click on the map. That was the Taliban time. He arrived to Zaranj. And that time, the capital of the province and market was in the Gorgori area that is located in Khashrod district. He brought fuel from Iran and sold in Gorgori Bazaar. There was no any official border in Zaranj at that time. He maintained a good business relation with other Pashtun and Baloch trader of fuel, and also was maintained his relation with the drug smugglers as well there. And that time there were two main trading items in Gorgori Bazaar that were the fuel and drugs. According to some people, he found his initial capital when there was bombing on Gorgori Bazaar, and the trader was who was linked to Taliban. They escaped from the area and their drug stock was captured by him. In the first years of the Republic, the Milak official border was opened. He used his relation with Baloch and Pashtun traders and start his work on official border and import fuel from Iran. And some people said that he export drug from Afghanistan to Iran through Milak border. He has maintained his relation with political figures in Kandahar and Kabul for protection of his business. When in 2011, the wall was constructed by Iranian government on the border, he continued his good relation with border authorities and tribal connection and continue his business. In 2008 and 9, he has maintained relation with Taliban as well. He invested his own capital for the management of the custom of Zaranj and constructed a place opposite to the custom house for 170 registered commission car. He tried to get political support from trusted Taliban for his business and provide service to them throughout his office and the commission car collect tax for Taliban and government in Zaranj custom office. He established a treatment center for abducted people by his own capital in Zaranj city. His business was badly affected when losing his political protection in 2009. In Kandahar, his business partner was with access to the palace was killed. With the arrival of new commander, security commander in Kandahar, his business became worse. In 2020, when his Talib supporter was killed in air attack, he was arrested by other Taliban because they blame him for stolen of custom money. In August 2021, like other government employee and other large trader, he escaped to Iran. Now he is in Iran. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. While you click on to the next to the next slide. I just want to highlight, I forgot this one. We just want to highlight one thing. You know, that's fine. Go back. No, one more click. Yes, that's it. I just wanted to highlight one point here for the audience that really, I think, puts him as a broker into the center. So basically, what he, as a private trader, he built on his own money, and opposite the official custom office, office buildings for over 100. Local, they call it Commissioner Carr, who provides services to get traders with lowered custom fees across the border. And he did that in agreement with the government and with the Taliban. And he collected taxes both for the Taliban and for the government. So he had this kind of bridging function here, and that is, I think, something that is really interesting. So the next brief life history will focus on a small trader, I should say. And I again want to start with a quotation from the interview here. I wasn't smuggling drugs during the Taliban regime because there was more profit in fuel trade for small traders like me. During the last years of the Taliban rule and first years of Karzai government, the drug trade in Kang district was dominated by large traders from Helmand. When Iran built the border wall, open access fuel smuggling for smaller traders stopped. Half of the district population left for the city or for Iran. Most of the families staying behind, then engaged in drug trafficking. Rasool Khan, over to you.
Thank you. Please, next slide. Yes, as mentioned that the second left is belong to the small smuggler, fuel and drugs. He was born in 1970 in Pashtun family in Badaghis province. Please click on the map. During the communist regime, he moved to Iran and returned back to Lashwa district of Farah province in 1980. Yes, click on. He faced with the discrimination of the Tajik people there in Lashwa district and moved to Kang district of Nimroz province with 15 other families from his household. In the Kang district, he saw free and open border for trading from Iran and easy trading of fuel there. He started the fuel business from Iran to Kang, and also he export rice and some other household items from Afghanistan to Iran. Click on the map. Yes. He established himself as a small landowner and cultivate about 1 acre agricultural land, but had to join with the Mujahideen party for protection of his business and avoiding from the tax with the party of Hizb Islami. When in 1990, the Taliban was arrived in rule, the leader of the Mujahideen was escaped to Iran, security was improved, and border trade was the main economy activity in Kang district. He continued his fuel business. A few people was involved in drug smuggling. In the last years of the Taliban, drug smuggling was increased, and large Helmandi trader arrived from Helmand and started work there in Kang district. He also entered to the drug business. That was the time the drug production was significantly increased. Local drug market was open in Khash Road and also in Bakwa of Farah province. In response to the construction of the wall, he used different methods for the drug transportation, such as payment to the border guard, use of ladder to the wall, and also use of catapult. And also with his relation with the Baloch people, his relation in the other side of the border, and and also his trader partner from fuel smuggling days, they were out of work as well. During his business, in one trip, together with other villagers and traders, they got agreement for opening of the gate to Iran during the night for transportation of 2,000 kilogram opium, which 30 kilograms of himself. The agreement called Salai in the local language, and the gate called Burjak. When they transported drug to the Iran side, Iranian border guard broke the agreement and captured all 2,000 kilograms of ping from them. He lost his capital. Then he used his 3 cars, which he have for transportation of the people in Kang to the ranch. He continued his drug business until he lost all capital when his Baloch partner in Iran from the fuel smuggling days refused to pay the largest shipment he had ever delivered. He was unable to recover his money in foreign country in Iran and also got into trouble with the Taliban connected drug trader. He received loan from them in Bakwa. After that, he lost his trust and didn't able to find loan for running off his business. From other side, the exchange rate of the Iranian Tuman in law enforcement measurement has negative impact on his business. In the result, he became out from the drug business. Now he is at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasool Khan. So
Thanks.
in summary, please, next slide. In summary, next slide. We find that with a transformation from an open frontier towards more state-affected border province, demands for cross-party brokerage services equipped with political protection has increased. Opportunities at the same time from cross-border trade are getting more vertically integrated, benefiting those with access to brokers and pushing smaller traders out of formal business and into the drug cross-border trade, where they take higher risks, but are still able to avoid or corrupt state representatives as a remaining option. Now, this is of course prior to the recent Taliban takeover. Now, finally, we want to look at these transformations from two perspectives and draw some and highlight some points from the border perspective and from the trading perspective. So next slide, please. So from the border perspective, what these sketches of the biography show that the repeated moments of rupture within Afghanistan, recent Afghan history, the latest one, of course, the recent Taliban takeover of the whole country, and rupture also in the wider region, changed the regulation and the opportunity structures around the border dramatically. And two of these aspects here, two such cases, of course, that we highlighted are shown here. The first picture shows how the official border crossing satellite image here changed in 2005 dramatically from a like an open desert space into a more infrastructure built-up area, and the lower picture here shows the border wall, which emerged in 2009 and to some extent sealed off the border. So since 2001, the border region became a growing zone of opportunity for some, while squeezing out others and pushing them into illicit trade, small-scale trade, high-risk trade. This in turn changed the landscape and dynamics of brokerage. Brokerage became much more requested and important for those who still wanted to trade in larger quantities because of the squeeze out and the vertical integration. Baloch-dominated cross-border networks remained important for illicit cross-border trade, with reliable networks in key areas, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan and Iran. And this is now more important after the Taliban takeover, when this kind of networks of trust might be not that important anymore for security within, for the smuggling within Afghanistan, because the Taliban, so far at least, that might change, provides some degree of common peace. But on the Pakistani side and Iranian side, that is still hugely important and possible to operate without that. Next slide. So can we have the next slide? Yeah, and then finally the trading perspective. We mentioned the boomtown dynamics in Zaranj already time and again as provincial center, but these effects were mixed, of course. There is clearly both licit and illicit trade facilitating the very visible accumulation and investment, not so much in production, but very much in services, hotels, and trade. But this goes alongside, and we have not really elaborated that in detail yet, but with manifestations of social disruption, higher criminality, and growing drug use. And you can see one of the pictures here to the right, basically showing that. These economic changes, they are not only induced by certain decisions of states, in this case elevating the border crossing to an official border crossing for huge imports, but it also has a gravitational pull on the state, on the central state, making it more interesting for civil servants, buying positions there, and participating in the rents that are generated in this boomtown. So, but this is, of course, a very uneven process, both for regulation and also for who's benefiting from that, leading to the emergence of a new trading equilibrium that is negotiated by local brokers whose capacity, whose qualities and services are getting more and more important. The benefits along the official crossing and trading routes are clearly concentrated and not widely spread. Specifically, they were further concentrated after the closure of the border elsewhere and the selective openings that were more easily controlled, and increased the vulnerability and outmigration from remoter border regions. So even before the Taliban takeover, before the recent drought, in some of the research districts, we had already a clear loss of 50% of the population simply because of less livelihood strategies, limiting portfolios here. And finally, governance arrangements and highly selective network state presence matters, but large parts of the province continuously remain outside and remained even before the Taliban takeover outside state control and kept state avoiding trading routes open for illicit trade. And that's the last slide that I want to share with you. Those who were in the session before have seen it. Can we have the last slide? Thank you so much. So I will not go into details here. These are the 3 trading routes that we identified during the fieldwork already post-Taliban takeover, but looking backwards. And it's just a good example from the trading perspective, how increased securitization and regulation of the border has led to 3 forms of adaptation here. One is these high-level integrated figures, like the first example in the biographical interview, who are still able to transport large quantities of illicit goods via the official border opening, and were investing themselves very visibly in this official border opening. The other one is the second route here, smaller traders, survival strategies, smaller amounts, but many traders still trying to make a living via somehow passing over the Kang border via catapults, ladders, and other technological small-time innovations. And then the last one here is this large detour for convoys and trucks transporting large quantities of drugs, providing security for themselves and completely bypassing and avoiding like hierarchical government-controlled areas, right from the production areas and the markets to via Pakistan to Iran through the Baluch areas. So next. Yeah, this is, I now hand over to Jonathan for the concluding remarks.
Thanks, Jan and Rasool Khan. If people have questions, can please think of them now, and we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So just to reiterate some of the points that have already been made, and to kind of highlight what we think is some important conclusions from this Borderland borrowing. The first is that this story, this Borderland story, is one of Nimroz's changing status over time, from being this remote and open frontier zone to a more regulated and more salient borderlands, linked to its changed status as a key trading hub, and the uneven diffusion of state power by 3 states to the border. Now, this change has not been, as Jan has said, been a smooth and linear process. It's occurred through fits and starts, and moments of rupture, or what we might call punctuated equilibrium, with the moments of rupture being related to conflict, to regime changes, to shifts in the geostrategic significance of the border, the reconfiguration of political settlements, as well as the changing role of licit and illicit economies. And what this story shows, unsurprisingly, is that borderlands are not just the passive receptors of state power. Borderland actors resist, subvert, co-opt, and redirect state-building efforts, trying to shape the rules of the game in their favor, to tilt the outcomes more favorably towards the borderlands. And I think the other thing that comes out here is the ambiguity of border zones as spaces of constraint and opportunity, risk and regulation, in which illicit economies are deeply embedded. And when we look at borderlands, it's important to see them as interconnected zones, that, you know, they don't stop at the border. The border connects as well as divides. It creates both constraints and opportunities. It acts as a filter rather than an impermeable membrane. It enables or disables particular flows and connections. And this kind of environment of opportunity and constraint creates both a need and an opportunity for brokerage and intermediation. And the 2 life stories that Ghulam and Rasool told, I think, are visible manifestations of this: the life history of the apex broker and, if you like, the tertiary broker. And also what these pictures, these stories show is how, and I think we need to bring this out more in our when we write up this kind of borderland biography, is how individual life histories are tied up with wider spatial histories, and also how these spatial histories of illegality are entangled with wider transformations going on at the national and the regional levels. So it goes back to what I was talking about this morning about starting from the edges tells you something about broader systems of power and of political economy. What the 2 case studies show is how securitization of the border has not ended illicit trade, but it's brought about new forms of regulation that have had very important distributional effects, changing the rules of the game and who the players are within that game. And the final point, and again, I think we need to bring this out more in our writing, and we only gave hints at it today, is about the boomtown dynamics of borderlands and how these boomtowns contribute to actually existing development, though they have major costs and trade-offs. The margins, as I've said repeatedly now, are spaces of rapid and transformative change. And we see these boomtown dynamics based, if you like, on agglomerations of illegality in many of our fieldwork sites, not only in Zaranj, but for example in Moosakhel, in Shan State in Myanmar. So what Zaranj is an exemplar of is this unruly form of development that acts as a gravitational pull, as Jan said, on people, on capital, on commodities, on the state and on the non-state. And of course, these forms of development come with major costs and distributional effects. But we need to understand these dynamics better, and to understand how illicit borderlands are so crucial to this current moment, to Afghan survival, and given the current climate crisis that's going on within the country. So I'll finish there, and now if anyone would like to kind of ask questions or make comments, please do so before we go on to the next session.
We don't have the Q&A anything. I think there are 22 people involved. I just wanted, because we didn't, I sort of brushed over that, this question of how this now changes with the after the Taliban takeover, because the Nimroz research indeed is our first systematic glimpse into what the change of de facto government means for the borderlands. We discussed it, of course, internally already a little bit, but this question of whether the measures that we described in detail, basically taken by Pakistan and by Iran in terms of securitization of their own border, of their own borderlands that also were similarly, open for a long time from their perspective, how sustainable that is. It's quite obvious, and OSDR collected some anecdotal evidence, videos from different parts of the border, that the Taliban are trying to win some local support by cracking open the securitized border again, trying to put pressure on the Pakistani side, on the Iranian side, and trying to even break open some of the, or to prevent some new infrastructure to be set up. And there have been some skirmishes and clashes, and they use that basically to win some support by local communities, showing that they are guardians of open cross-border trade, including, of course, what is generally considered illicit goods like drugs. So the question of how, Iran and Pakistan are very serious. As Pakistan, we are studying that also from the other side, from the integration of the former Fatah into the normal governance system. So they are very serious and consistent in trying to change the that part of the borderland. And the question really is, will it crack open again? Will it be, like you called it, this kind of cyclical developments, and will it move back into more of a frontier zone, Nimroz, which it has been for decades and centuries, or will there be some sustainable changes now, induced maybe more so by Iran and Pakistan than by Afghanistan?
Thanks, Jan. So I think we've written about some kind of smaller, shorter pieces about how current events are playing out in the borderlands. Something that was very noticeable at the time that the government was falling, how there seemed to be a systematic kind of strategy on the part of the Taliban to take the key border points, because these are the key sources of revenue as a country that depends on, in many ways, for cross-border trade. Being able to choke off those points was a way of stopping revenue from accumulating to the government, and also of gaining revenue. So I think in terms of that story, it's very important, but now it's absolutely crucial to people's survival.
Yes,
and other sources of income available.
And just this, you were very surprised when I, from the debriefing, told you this result that the Taliban actually were pushed by larger scale fuel traders via Milak after the takeover to crack down on fuel smuggling in Kang, even though that was a truly a survival business, simply because they felt that they couldn't smuggle anymore. They were afraid of the Taliban, the fuel smugglers with their official large-scale fuel cars. The Taliban were raising the customs fee on the officially imported fuel, and they felt that it was unfair competition by these small-scale traders, and they managed to put pressure on the Taliban to stop this survival fuel trade across the Kang border, and the people couldn't do anything. We're helpless against that. Rasool Khan, is that correct?
Yeah, can I just jump in here? We've got a question from Stella, so I think we'll go on to that. And I think it's a really interesting insight that we've been discussing across the project. So Stella said, this research and insight reveals many of the skills networks in production, trading, innovation, and development developed in supporting the illicit economy. Has it revealed to you ways in which these skills networks can be captured for the illicit trade? And I think that is precisely the question we are asking ourselves. So, that there has there's huge kind of level of improvisation, innovation, and experimentation going on in the illicit economy in response to a very high risk and precarious environment. So is it possible to replicate those kinds of ingenuity, forms of innovation in the illicit economy? And I don't know if either of you want to think about this. I know Adam's in here as well. You might have some thoughts on this, but it is a key question.
Yeah, I mean, one point is, I think that what is licit and illicit has, the definition of that has changed. What you call the points of rupture, between these points of rupture under the Taliban in 1990, this differentiation between licit and illicit drugs or fuel was not really there. And then you have licit goods like fuel being smuggled, but sometimes very often being smuggled even in the same official cars that are being imported. This is why control over the border was so important for the apex broker, because within those cars you then also have compartments in which you smuggle fuel around the customs. So what is licit, what is illicit is one thing, and whether you can use after clearly regulation have been introduced and states set this differentiation between licit and illicit in terms of drugs, whether you can use some of this innovative skills for legal trade. I doubt that. I mean, there is you don't really need it, right? And if you look at the margin of profit, of course, that we are trying to do it systematically now, it's also very difficult. I mean, there seems to be, of course, some comparative advantage in the drug economy being defined as illicit. And so the specialization, the skills that Stella is mentioning here, the network skills that you need, they suddenly become comparative advantages only because this cross-border trade of drugs is being defined as illegal. So it elevates basically the profit from there for those who are still managing to do that. And you wouldn't have that, you couldn't use the same skills, or they wouldn't pay the same revenue basically if you used it for fully legal trade, I think.
Thanks, Jan. I'm going to just jump in now. I mean, I know if Adam was answering this question, he would also say, well, what is so particular about drugs? We have this discussion about onions, because if you look at how markets function in Afghanistan, they are shaped by power relations, by access to the means of violence. They all take place in an environment of high risk. And so the counter argument, I mean, it's not that I disagree with what you said. I think there's something fundamental about a commodity being illegal, which makes it different. But there's a lot of commonalities between drugs, onions, potatoes, wheat, or so on, in terms of the marketplace in which they function in Afghanistan. So I guess the thing to be asking ourselves, responses to Stella's question, is about, if you're going, there's no kind of, we know there's no magic bullet alternative to drugs, saffron or another cash crop. It's about changing the kind of the precarity of the environment, so that markets are not so closed. There are structures in which conflicts can be processed through kind of more formal and more legal mechanisms, in which not just the extremely powerful with access to the means of coercion can get access to. So I think it's useful to think about what's different between licit and illicit, but we also need to think about how there's lots of similarities in the current environment in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I agree, but isn't the catch-22 that basically, I mean, the question of what is so special about drugs only that they are defined as illegal? And I mean, Adam just now in his presentation say it again, that there is no real alternative for border communities in order to stay and have and remain and retain access to their land than investing in drugs. And the problem would be that the catch-22 would be that only while they are defined as illegal, you have these kind of profits that help even smaller farmers to retain access to their land under precarious circumstances, and there's no alternative for that.
Jan, sorry, Jan, I've got to interrupt you. We've just got a message. We're going to go back into the main.
You are very welcome.
But thank you very much. I'd like to thank Jan. I'd like to thank Rasool Khan, and I hope we'll see you in the final kind of set of reflections today. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.